Let's get started, Prati. Welcome. Let me just quickly set the context for the session to the audience. Thank you for tuning in for this session. I'm Emma. I'm the CEO of Longhash Ventures. Welcome to the Mentor Insight series that's organized by Longhash Ventures. So today we are very honored to be joined by Prati, director from Temasek. He's part of the blockchain venture building team and Temasek, and he's also being a mentor of Longhash Ventures, helping startups to give advices. So we're very glad to have him today. Before I pass the mic to Prati to quickly introduce himself and all the exciting things they're doing at Temasek, let me just quickly introduce what Longhash to the audience who are not familiar with us. So we're a blockchain-focused global accelerator and investor. We've been in operation for about 2 years. We've today accelerated about 18 companies and helped them raise the collective of US dollar 16 million, mostly in equity. And these are extremely early stage companies between pre-seed to pre-A. Over the last 2 years, we've also built a relatively comprehensive network across Asia. Right now, we've just launched our current batch of open finance focused acceleration batch of 7 projects. And that is why we feel it's extremely important for us to talk about how blockchain can fundamentally transform finance. And I think Prati is definitely one of the most ideal candidates to talk about this, given all the stuff, exciting venture building they're doing at Temasek. And also the recent exciting news about Temasek joining Libra. So I have so many questions. I believe you guys too. Let me just quickly introduce a brief on the format. So today we're probably going to spend 30 minutes with me asking questions because I've earned that privilege by organizing the event. But after that, we will definitely leave ample time for the projects of this batch of Longhash Ventures to ask questions. And then lastly, open up the floor to the audiences to ask any burning questions you have. So without further ado, let me pass the mic to Prati. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself and your background and also about Temasek Venture Building?
Sure. Firstly, honored to be here. It's more of my honor than yours, Emma. Getting used to the new world of speaking in a webinar format now. So I have to say, we generally keep quite a low profile at Temasek. So, but happy to be part of this event here today. My own background is I've grown up in India. I'm an accountant by training. Worked in India for quite a few years. Moved to Singapore after my master's 14 years back. So been a resident of Singapore for very long. Have come from more the sell side. And I joined Temasek a few years as part of the global financial services effort. I always joke about it, but I'm a diversity hire. And that can only happen in Singapore for a male to be a diversity hire. But in my role at Temasek, I've traditionally looked at a number of our global markets from a financial services lens. So as far out as US, Brazil, Africa, India, and insurance. As part of the Temasek focus on new technologies and looking at emerging trends, we had formed 2 new teams last year. And I have to say, I'm amongst the many skeptics of blockchain technology. So somewhat reluctantly took on the role to lead our efforts in the blockchain space, partly because of a lot of the earliness and the fatigue around the space. But as my team and I have done more work, we've actually built a fair amount of conviction in some of the use cases which we think we can bring to an inflection point. So we've shifted our focus a little away from the traditional investing lens. So I wouldn't say venture building is like the new mantra for Temasek, but it is definitely a focus for my team to see how we can bring our knowledge, our networks, hopefully our credibility and our capital to bear to take some of these efforts really to the next level. So that's really where me and my team spend a lot of time. It's a small team of 7 people in Temasek that look at this effort here.
Thank you, Prati. I think when you talk about the whole, changing your perspective from being skeptical to be convinced and actively venture building, I just feel like so much vindication there. Because when me and Shikai left McKinsey and start this accelerator, I think all I've been hearing from my colleagues were like, oh, what, you're money laundering, buying crypto. So that was like some of the negative connotations associated with this place. So it's glad to see more and more institutional investors, governments that's coming to this place and actively exploring the use cases of blockchain?
Yeah, what I will say is a majority of the stuff we still see doesn't make sense. I think you've got to sift through everything that you see and focus your areas on applications, essentially, which can really make an impact and deliver value to the end user. So that's really where we've built conviction. And I'll talk through some of the frameworks that we've applied here. Yeah.
That'd be great. So my first question, given I think you already gave a brief introduction about the venture building and Temasek, right? Would you like to perhaps dive a bit deeper? Because I noticed a couple of days ago, you guys, released all this hiring information about the 3 ventures you guys are building. Perhaps you can give a bit of color around what are the themes of these different ventures you guys are building, and what are the thought process behind it?
Yeah, so I'll start with the thought process. And then happy to share to the extent I can. I mean, some of these we're not able yet to share a lot of public information, but we've had some public releases, announcements, either because of partners who were keen or at our own end. First and foremost, the view we have is actually not so much about venture building per se. It's more about where is the application of the technology. And a lot of the skepticism, even for me, was not so much around whether the technology makes sense. It is more a period of time lens that you apply as to when do you actually think the adoption will come and what does it actually take to drive adoption. We broadly put it into 2 buckets now. We look at it and say, hey, there are business models today that are centralized, but you could argue that there is no need for certain government agencies or platforms to actually take that centralized risk. You would actually have a lot more efficiency if you had a decentralized business model around that. Clearing would be a good example of that, where there's always a debate about the amount of capital that's required, the inefficiency that comes from different ledgers, so on and so forth. But if you put that on a shared ledger, you have a lot more efficiency, lesser capital requirements, so on and so forth. You could also argue that for some government functions. And then there is the completely new paradigm, which I know it gets very exciting to say, hey, once you have the technology and a convergence of underlying technology trends come to place, plus business models, which are moving more and more towards open data and open collaboration, can you construct completely new business models, right? So I think that's the framework that we apply as a team on the blockchain side in Temasek. Within that, we divide our current efforts into, I would say, broadly 4 buckets. Now, these are not exhaustive. In fact, the approach we took in arriving at this was more about the fastest sort of the finishing line, in that if we saw meaningful impact, we saw size, we saw feasibility, then we wanted to sort of expend time and energy there. The first bucket really is around what we like to call programmable money, but think of it essentially as truly creating digital currencies and tokenizing a fiat in particular, and then creating payment rails on which it can then be moved. So money and the movement of money. So that's one sort of key pillar for us. In that context, we got involved thanks to MAS in Project Ubin last year, and have been working with JP Morgan as a technology partner and a number of industry participants and several of the banks actually in creating a prototype of a multi-currency payments network. The view there is that there's actually a number of wholesale payments use cases that can be enabled by this new payments technology if it is taken to commercialization, which we continue to do some work around. Then analogous to that was our recent sort of effort where we joined Libra, and I know a lot has been said and written about Libra as they've brought changes to a lot of the frameworks, and you would have seen this in the Libra 2.0 white paper. We think it creates the ability to create a global retail payments network. So quite complementary in the sense we're doing work around wholesale payments here in Singapore, and then there is like an opportunity for a global payments retail network. So that's the first bucket. The second bucket is saying, okay, you dealt with money and movement of money, then how do you look at assets? There's a lot happening around crypto assets, and I'll talk about that later, but how do we do work around tokenizing the very core of capital markets? And again, we had made a release in November last year. We've been working quietly in the background with Singapore Exchange taking the lead, and HSBC and some of the other banks to see how we can truly digitize the process of the issuance and servicing of fixed income assets. So that's again something we've been testing and working in the background on. And the third one, which is really the one that you're referring to, where we came out of stealth mode for the first time, and we were forced to, because if you have to hire people, we do need to get the word out there. It was funny, we were in stealth, and some people actually checked informally whether it was a bit of a scam, and we had to say, no, Temasek is actually backing and has seeded this venture.
It is quite unusual.
So it's quite unusual, but it's also a pretty large effort to see how can we create a new portable digital identity solution, or technically what's called self-sovereign identity. Essentially an ecosystem where individuals and organizations have greater control over the data, which is not just machine readable, so structured, but actually has standardized representations, which gives it portability. So you can use that across different ecosystems or platforms, and also has the level of authentication that's possible. So it's really creating trusted data. But the unique effort for us is we are also building some front-end applications. One application in India looking at job matching, which is highly topical now, and a cross-border SME B2B trade discovery platform. So that's really a bulk of the effort that we have. In many of these instances, we're working with partners. Temasek is not an operating company, but we obviously bring many advantages to the table, we think. So either pulling in equity partners or pulling in operating partners who are helping us stand up some of these ventures. And then we do some investing activity on the side, but it's really very early stage as a broader space. So that's very, very limited for us right now, because generally if Temasek would come in, we would write much larger checks.
Wow, that is a lot to take away. But I think if I so it looks like the projects Temasek is involved in are by and large and addressing the fundamental infrastructure, right? Either it's the key tenets of the financial world. You talk about the money itself, the movement of the money, and then the assets that's building on top of that kind of system. How do you issue assets? How do you settle assets? How do you service assets, right? There's a lot of fundamental infrastructure. Even the digital identity part is also an infrastructure that can be used widely across not just finance, but literally everything, right? So it definitely makes sense from a given Temasek's background as a state-owned entity to tackle these problems. So I think one of the plugin here is given Pradi is actively hiring across, I think, Singapore, Mumbai, Shanghai, Berlin. So the audiences, if any of you guys are interested, perhaps go and check out a Temasek website and see if there's any roles that's suitable for you. But let's go back to the topic, right? So today I want to talk about how blockchain transforms finance. Now, we already talked about the key tenants, right? I think it completely makes sense of the areas you guys are tackling. So what is the vision for Temasek, right? Do you envision like the whole, I guess the financial infrastructures of today's world is going to be replaced by a blockchain enabled kind of, with money built on digital ledger, asset moving on that? Is there a concrete vision you guys are building towards?
Yeah. So firstly, it's not just us, right? To be clear, I mean, our effort is one of many, many efforts in the space. What I'd say is, firstly, actually nothing to do with that being state-owned, but it's more to do with the fact that if you think about, and you're spot on, we've essentially said, I would almost describe it as 3 layers if I were to oversimplify this, and I know the purists would take exception to this, but I would just say there's a protocol layer where it is insane to see the level of innovation at the speed at which that innovation is coming. So funnily enough, no one's having debate about energy consumption anymore, because you've moved away from saying, hey, everything that we do at the protocol from a consensus perspective will be driven by proof of work, right? And of course, Bitcoin is here to stay. But if you think about a lot of the newer protocol technologies that are coming up, the conscious observation we first have is that space is just going to see innovation for many, many years. We launched a technical assessment a few months back. We've had to go refresh our list like just last week, because there were a couple of new interesting projects that came up, and we said, hey, we've got to include them in the list. So if I just sort of put a framework around it, therefore, the vision is that the protocol layer will see innovation. There's a lot of technologies, a lot of talent sort of going behind that. We then are focused more on the foundational layers, as you said. So it's about digital currencies, It's about digital assets and then identity and data. And then there are the, what I would call the vertical slivers, where there are very, very specific use cases that are being built. Now, more directly on your question of what does blockchain do for finance, I would almost argue that from here on, the technology enablers all exist. In fact, you've seen a wonderful confluence of number of technologies in the space of computing, cryptography, cloud, etc., which is coming together in a way which truly enables blockchain or decentralized technologies. The real sort of trend we now see is changes that are coming about to business models and legal frameworks. And really, and I think for this, anybody who's been in the technology space would have seen the trend that happened decade by decade. There's a flavor of the decade around platforms. And if you think about platforms, it's all about a closed ecosystem. And now you see a lot of focus from regulators, from certain private enterprises on open data frameworks. And how do you sort of now unlock data and sort of open it up? The real trend we see here in the financial services or broader fintech context for blockchain is more open collaboration, because there's an increasing realization that it's very difficult for everyone to go create a platform. So how do you form create business models which allow collaboration across different businesses? So that's really, I think, I would say at a trend level is something that we've seen that has interested us. Now, having said that, the financial services space is highly regulated and has a lot of systemic risk, and therefore it will just take time. Interestingly, it is the currency layer which is beginning to see the most movement. And normally you would have not predicted that sort of a few years back. Whether it is CBDCs, whether it's stable coins, but just the movement of money is the one that we think is really where the most exciting activity is happening on a global basis, right? A number of efforts, whether it's in the governments, whether it's sort of private efforts, where some of the efforts where we are getting involved more on the private side, or whether, frankly, it's what initially people would dismiss as just the pure crypto world, beginning to actually now deliver a lot of value for cross-border transfers. Because eventually users just care about, hey, if I can immediately send money from point A to B, it's still not scalable, but it's definitely a space to watch out as stablecoins, etc., sort of come to the fore. So I would call that one out as, I think, the breakout trend that we begin to see. What's very interesting, though, is that we continue to see efforts, early efforts in the asset tokenization space. I would say that would take longer because, it's not like capital markets are completely dysfunctional, no matter what anybody says. And the benefits, therefore, need to be proven so that the various participants can take the risk of moving from one infrastructure to the other. So that we think sort of requires a more patient sort of effort over the years. And then obviously there's the whole OTC world, over-the-counter world, and everything from alternative assets to private securities, a number of which obviously efforts in Singapore. And then, I would also almost put trade finance in that area. Anything to do with sort of digital assets, trade, etc., is slowly and steadily beginning to gain pace, is our observation. But, it'll take time again.
Yeah, I want to dive deeper into one of the points you point out, right? The most interesting area you guys pay a lot of attention to, which is the currency parts. You talk about how CBDC is coming out. There are like a dozen governments, working, I think, at breakneck speed in China. So in some of the cities, it's already, I think, under pilots. And then you have the stable coin. There must be, I lost track, right? More than 50 or 100 stable coin out there. They're all trying to push adoption. And here you have Libra, which came out, and obviously everyone is like, wow, this project is super ambitious, because of Facebook's existing 2 to 3 billion users, right? That would means instant mass adoption overnight. So how do you see this kind of different currencies, different things play out, the dynamics?
Yeah. So the call we took more than a year back when we decided to go deeper in the space is that we do think the core efforts, at least for us as an institution, I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to translate for everyone, has to be around taking fiat and tokenizing fiat is really what I would say. Because monetary policy considerations are not going away. It's going to be very difficult at scale to be building completely new currency systems in the near to medium term. I mean, I think in the future, the world may look extremely different. And you're beginning to see actually regulations continue to be quite responsive in that context. I mean, you see the Payment Services Act, you see a whole bunch of regulations coming across the region and internationally. What I would say is that Libra is in a somewhat of a different category in that if you sort of go beyond looking at Facebook as just sort of the anchor, which is the obvious attraction for a number of parties, is it brings the potential for what are otherwise competing consumer-facing applications to come onto a common network, right? So that, if you ask me the very core of it, that is sort of the promise. And as Temasek, we're generally sort of platform agnostic, right? So we are naturally keen on the proposition of what it could deliver, and therefore we've chosen to join them. But generally, any sort of effort which is able to take consumer pockets on a global basis, connect it, and create these efficient payment rails is really what is at the core of the thesis. And then when you layer on activity, the ability to take digital assets and embed payments into digital assets is really sort of the next level of attraction. So even if you go back to Ubin, what Ubin has sort of proven is that you can add a lot more functionality to money than what actually exists today. I mean, people may just commonly call it smart contracting, but literally, if I could put a whole bunch of conditions attached to money and have a true movement of money in an automated manner, that is very, very interesting. And it opens up use cases which, just did not exist previously. So, I mean, our focus is naturally in some of these areas. But what I will say is that as a lot of the underlying infrastructure begins to get regulated, there is that possibility as you have more interesting user interfaces, stablecoins, etc., are also likely to gain momentum. I would almost put it right now in the category of the protocol layer, saying there's so much innovation happening there that I think anyone who makes money on that is just gotten probably lucky or is deeply, deeply insightful, which at least, I wouldn't claim to be on which would be the winning stablecoin project or any of these efforts sort of shining through. What is here to stay is that governments have realized that they do need to truly digitize their currencies. And it's only a matter of time that happens across different regions.
Yeah, I feel it's almost like the modern age currency war, right? It's a control you have to, or influence you have to fight for in the more technology-enabled world. And now amid the COVID-19 outbreak, everything is accelerated as well. So I did have a look at Libra Association's members, right? I think it's interesting to look at the composition. There's the tech giants such as the Uber, Lyft. There's the blockchain native, very influential Silicon Valley investors like the Union Square Ventures, the Paradigm. And then there's also a couple of digital assets, I guess, pioneers, Coinbase, Tagomi, Sapo. Actually, I think those two are acquired by Coinbase by now. But Temasek does stand out as a, sorry to bring up the state-owned entity angle again, but I think that, a few members would have the match of the resource and the influence and the status of Temasek, right? Yeah. So what kind of role do you think Temasek will play in the Libra Association?
So we are very used to playing this role in the Asian context. It's not the first time that Temasek would get involved in, although this is much earlier than our typical sort of investment or project. But there are a number of companies who've chosen to work with us, and we have chosen to support their activities in bringing them in particular to Asia, although now our business is truly global, and therefore our ability to extend the reach is global. But in this particular instance, it's definitely about a lot of the members, if you noticed, are in the Western Hemisphere, in the traditional sense. We do have members who are present in Africa, but there was any meaningful sort of Asia anchoring of the membership. So we do see this as the first sort of effort for them to involve Asia and for us to see if we can anchor the needs, which is clearly present in this part of the region. And again, our role here is more to help them understand the region, for them to navigate the region better, but really the value that a proposition that can bring to the end user. And therefore just guiding them through what the possibilities here are, and helping them sort of make the relevant introductions, so on and so forth in the region. From a regulatory perspective, Libra has actually been quite engaged through FINMA with the Global Regulatory College. And a lot of the feedback that's come in globally is actually reflected in the changes that were announced as part of the recent white paper. There is a lot of work to be done around KYC, AML, around data privacy, although the everything that we've seen is fundamentally designed towards delivering a lot of privacy towards the end user. But making sure and having compliance at the wallet level or at the member level, etc., is we're seeing positive developments. But therefore, a lot of the Asian feedback has probably gone back to Libra. It's more now about user adoption in the context of Libra.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So now, given Temasek is part of Libra, does that mean CBDC by Singapore government is out of the question, or is this a different version?
So, I mean, I definitely cannot speak for the government, right? we don't have the relevant insights into what the government may be thinking on any of these matters. What I will point out is that MAS has been one of the most forward-looking regulators, not just in the region, but globally. And it's not just because we're part of UBIN Phase 5, a report for which will come out sort of shortly in the coming weeks and months. If there is a commercial case for issuing CBDCs, I'm sure at the appropriate time, not just Singapore, but other sort of regulators and governments in the region will consider it. So really can't comment on their behalf.
Yeah.
What I would say for Libra, though, is that is if you sort of speak to Libra directly, you will hear from them that they're creating in simple English, just the rails. There is no desire, especially under Libra 2.0, to create new currencies. So if in any of the major countries where Libra is accessible and available, if there is the creation of a digital currency, that would plug in beautifully into a network like Libra. And this would hold true not just of Libra, this would hold true of any regional or international payments networks that get created on shared ledger technology, and therefore would truly allow peer-to-peer transactions. So, I think it's only a matter of time where at least some countries issue digital currencies, which are then available. And then you don't need a Libra US dollar or a Libra euro in that instance.
Yeah. That does remind me of the recalling the Libra 2.0 design. I think it's basically Libra token wrapped around a proportional nominal percentages of different digital version of the fiat, if I understand correctly. So perhaps I have one last question. I want to bring it back to venture building, right? Given our community is largely builders, projects that are exciting to look for the next big idea, right? So I think you mentioned about, a lot of the infrastructure for the financial world are being built, programmable money, movement of money, the network and all that. What are the pockets of areas you think could mean big opportunities for startups to look into? Or maybe this is just very early stage, there can be many idea in the future.
So there is, frankly, in terms of ideation, we went crazy. So we identified many, many areas. A lot actually depends upon what is the stage of the company and the appetite from different companies, right? And I'm not, so I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer that unless it's very specific to who and what kind of entities they're talking about. I'll give you an example, right? For the life of me, and I'll jump to one of the questions you had in your sort of prep, was let's just take gaming as an example. Why can't you have digital assets in the gaming world? And by the way, I'm not a big gamer, but one of the things I'm personally terribly excited by, and it's through one of the funds, there's a small investment that's been made in the US, but nothing directly by us as Temasek, where you should be able to have, gaming assets that can be interoperating across different platforms. Now, the problem with that is you need to go to the publishers, you need to just turn around the complete industry. What I would almost say is that there's so much talent in the region. If you look at you need to just look at the stock price, right, for C, and what powers that. It's amazing how large that market is. We ourselves have investments in some companies across the region where, it's a big space. But if you look at the application, and I'm just using an extreme example maybe, but
Mm.
the real use case, a lot of people made fun of CryptoKitties in the beginning, including me. And they're like, what's the point of CryptoKitties? But this, if you really go deeper and you understand this notion that a digital asset, which otherwise might look identical, but can have unique ownership attached to it, and what you have is portability, but not fungibility of that asset becomes quite interesting, right? So I'm just saying that's one example of an area where we would be excited if we saw anything coming out of scale, assuming obviously it's kosher from a regulatory perspective. It's always a tricky area. That's very interesting, right? If you look at today, even with trade finance, etc., there are now very specialized solutions that can be built. So you can leave all the hard work to different people to bring together the banks and different parties, but there are almost analytical layers that can be built. We're beginning to see communication protocols being built across various blockchain protocols. I think there are so many areas that you can now go into. The bet that one needs to take is, do we take a very specific vertical and go after that industry, right? And therefore, deliver value, or do I continue to bet that eventually some of the applications will take off and keep working at the technology layer? Now, someone like Temasek is happy to take that infrastructure layer and invest in that over a long period of time. And that's why I say it depends on the appetite of, who the actual venture is.
Yeah.
And in most cases, being early stage, I would almost say identifying verticals and then building around that may be the more interesting thing.
Yeah. I think when you talk about gaming, that really resonate with me, because one of our two theses, the first is around digital asset infrastructure that revolves around, Bitcoin being, the digital gold, and people want to diversify into it. The second part is really a Web 3.0 economy where blockchain technology can be used to redefine the relationship between user and data. And because you're able to establish authenticity, so you are able to assign value to it, and then you are able to exchange it through very frictionless market on a global scale, that almost instantly create a huge economy. And obviously for that to happen, I think a lot of the, say, for example, digital identity, or maybe in some cases the IoT, some of the adjacent infrastructures or technologies will have to happen, and like including the regulatory infrastructure. But I think it's almost palpable, this kind of potential, right? You can see how that could become a huge economy. So with that said, I think maybe we will take is there anything else you would like to share now, or should we take a quick break for 2-3 minutes and then we can continue with the Q&A?
Yeah, I think it's probably best to take it as part of Q&A. So we could take a few minutes break and then come back to the extent there are any questions.
Yeah, awesome. So, all right. So we'll come back in 2 minutes. Just take a quick break.
At least I don't have conviction yet that the technology in of itself will solve the issue. So therefore, even when you go back to some of the work we're doing with SGX, we're going to fixed income, right? We're going to the very core of capital markets, because these are low margin products. There is any benefits you deliver, everybody across the value chain goes like, wow, that's fantastic, right? I can get my money faster. My sort of settlement clearing cycles are lower. There's more efficiencies, common workflows. Asset servicing on a post-trade basis is more efficient. Whereas in a lot of these where the margins are anyways very thick, it appears to us that you need to solve the business side as much as you need to solve the technology side. So quite an interesting opportunity, but it will take some time, at least in my view.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for sharing. Thank you, Erin. I think we can also take a few questions from the board. We have a question from Melissa Lee. Melissa has been a very active community member. I think she does a lot of private investment. So the question from her is, several of the large payment companies such as PayPal, Visa, MasterCard have pulled out from Libra. Please share your thoughts on how this has affected Libra. But I think this predates you guys joining. So
yeah, so
I'll leave it to you.
It predates us joining, was obviously a consideration for us before we joined in thinking through some of these matters. The question is more around the forward-looking view on what is the potential, who are the parties getting involved. It's to be proven out. I think Libra went through a hype cycle, then it went through a very negative news cycle, prompted by many, many things. The white paper that's come out and the changes that are taken are highly relevant and responsive to not just regulatory needs, but also business community needs. And that's really what we take comfort in, and where we have sort of chosen to get involved. What I would say is, if you do have user adoption, it's inevitable that networks will link to each other, right? So we'll obviously leave it to the networks as to when they choose to engage, so on and so forth. But at this stage, I would say Libra is hopefully stabilizing. It's not going into that negative cycle. But again, a lot will depend obviously on the adoption side of the house now. I think that's really where the focus is. Whereas initially, if you see a lot of the objections that came were more on the regulatory and compliance, monetary policy, so on and so forth, which have been addressed at least to some extent. And it's public domain that Libra is applied to FINMA, so on and so forth. So the regulators have oversight, and presumably will do their jobs in looking at Libra and similar networks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the key changes, they've changed from plans to become a public permissionless network to permissioned. And to a lot of people, that seems to be a less ambitious version of it. But I think the reality is it's a practical version that makes people comfortable and that pushes the industry forward. And I think that's what's important.
The single biggest change, I think, actually is more on the single currency stablecoin system, as opposed to the original construct, which would have created a new currency. If I had to just single out sort of one change, to me, that is what that sort of is game changing. And of course, there's many other changes that were taking place, including sort of looking at private adoption.
Yeah, got it. We also have a question from Sam Sergio. So he's a very active angel investor that has been very active in Long Hash community for the last 2 years. So thank you for your support, Sam. You're always tuning in for our events. And so he has one question. Beyond some of the finance use cases you talked about, what are one or two other verticals you see blockchain having a major impact? So I think this will be outside of finance use case.
Yeah, so I mean, I've already called it out. There is maybe I'll add a third one, but identity, and that was actually, frankly, it's not finance related only, right? It's very broad based. So dealing with identity and data at the very core, because the ability to have the hashes on a sort of decentralized network and not having to go back to platforms and centralize, right? I think that's big. I think that's, in our view, and actually view of many people, a big use case. Second, I've spoken about gaming, and my team has been texting on the side and joking about my comments around gaming, right? The third one is, there's a lot of discussion around it, but around provenance is really something which, again, it goes back to this open collaboration. How do you get disparate institutions actually to come together and work together? Provenance is another use case where there's been very selective POCs, everything from food to engineering parts, so on and so forth, which is very relevant. And we see blockchain having an impact outside of financial services, the ones that, at least closer to us. And then, of course, actually the crypto world itself is maturing. So there's multiple layers of new business models coming in the crypto world. But that's a very different audience, so not everybody subscribes to that. We are watching it carefully to see if anything comes into the mainstream, including some of the underlying infrastructure layers there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brady. We also have a question from Zhao Chen, who is a partner at CMCC Global. So his question, actually he typed twice, he must really want to know, what do you think of the gold-backed stablecoin? Do you have any other precious metal backed stablecoin?
Yeah, so I think there are stablecoins and there are stablecoins and there are stablecoins, right? I have a bias towards what value are you delivering eventually to the users, and what's the pain point that you're solving. I mean, I think generally speaking, that trend of asset-backed sort of currencies is definitely here to stay. But I mean, I think it solves for many things, but I think you could solve it in other ways as well. Personally, it always boils to me on user adoption, and where are you embedding it? How are you actually solving that pain point? For example, if you're attaching it to digital assets, and therefore, driving adoption, that's interesting. But the underlying assets, obviously, gold would be interesting. Uh, but I don't have a strong point of view on one underlying versus the other, personally.
The next question we have from Henry, I think everyone in this room would like to know, is how long do you think blockchain will be widely used? 1 year, 2 year, 5 year? That's like $1 billion question.
I think it's use case by use case. And one of the questions you had asked earlier is advice to ventures in the space. It has to be a patient game. I think blockchain suffers from fatigue. Blockchain suffers from too much hype, lack of real focus in many areas of truly delivering value to the end user again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record. I do think that in the next couple of years, you will begin to see applications coming through at scale, which is really where you will see the impetus. But there are many areas where it will take at least 4 to 5 years, simply because if you're talking about replacing existing infrastructure, or you're talking about bringing disparate parties to the table, it takes long. And in other instances, you probably won't actually see success for blockchain technology. So again, it just depends on which use cases you're talking about. But definitely, I would put the bet on a couple of years, and you will not just get another email from someone saying, hey, listen, here's another enterprise blockchain solution which has failed. I think you'll see this positive news cycle of solutions being deployed at scale in select areas. And in many instances, the beauty would be where people won't even know that there's a decentralized layer below. Actually, that's the real beauty, right? I think that's where
that's the real adoption.
That's where we are excited by, where the end user doesn't care, right? And will simply be using something and may not even realize that the rails are decentralized.
Yeah, absolutely. We also have a question from TF from Hashkey Group. So this question is quite strategical. Does Temasek intend to champion blockchain industry applications with Temasek linked companies, given the strategical role of Temasek company in a wide range of industries, for example, to push industry use case for blockchain sector? That's also a very broad question.
Yeah, so one of the key benefits we obviously bring is our access. And access comes in two forms. It comes from very large companies, which are increasingly global, not just in Singapore. And then generally our access to companies, even where we're not investors. We are definitely looking to champion the cause for the technology in our portfolio. But we're going to be very selective on where we spend our time. We're a small team. It's not a lot of effort. And it's more about the community effort, right? I don't think the MARSOC in of itself is going to have some dramatic impact in the space, right? These are real sort of technology trends. Governments are being responsive. Business frameworks are changing. But yeah, I mean, if anybody has a direct question on Temasek, we are working on specific use cases, exploring. But in many instances, we run out of capacity, and we would play more of an advisory role or more of an introductory role, and sort of point companies, either external or our own portfolio companies, in the right direction, because they will need to build the capabilities themselves, and that's how we will sort of look at it. But anything that has direct linkage into any of the efforts that we have, or frankly, if anybody needs an introduction to a portfolio company where a use case makes sense, we do those introductions all the time because it's mutually beneficial. And we do want to play a bit of an evangelizing role in the community. Yeah.
We also have a question from Jack Cha. He's from Jack Global Consulting. So he has a question. Do you have any view on China's DCEP? And I think this question is similar to Paulo's question. Basically, what's Temasek's plan or your personal view in terms of China's blockchain efforts?
So China actually has a number of blockchain efforts, some of which have gone unnoticed. There's a lot of talk around sort of the CBDC, but actually, if you look in the public domain, you'll find a whole bunch of other efforts. For us as Temasek, when it comes to different sort of countries, I think we would much rather play that role in Singapore as building that connectivity or supporting commercial efforts from a connectivity lens, right? Um, we we are not well positioned to get involved in any state-owned efforts in any of these countries. China has the technology scene has a long history of innovation and platform creation and very rapid adoption of technology. So we do think China is, kind of moving ahead very quickly. A lot of interesting efforts coming out of China, and we need to have some interactions. But I think we would see it more as how do you take some of those efforts in China and connect it to global efforts. So, for example, eventually, as you think of offshore currency centers, so on and so forth, right? I think there's a role for places like Singapore, for other sort of money centers. If we can support from a technology lens, create that interoperability, I think that would be interesting for us. But again, I would encourage people to not just track what's happening with the DCEP initiative in China, but the other initiatives out of China are equally interesting in terms of the efforts. Now, I think the big debate and question, though, is, ultimately the true application of the technology in the in the real sense is around creation of trust, and so who's the gatekeeper? And initially, some of the efforts coming out of conglomerates, whether it's in China, whether it's in Korea, or anywhere else, we'd be like, these are open ecosystems, but they are obviously controlled by a conglomerate. So then, from an interoperability perspective, that does sometimes create some issues. But over time, I'm sure as they scale, these will be solved for.
Thank you, Prati. All these are very difficult questions to answer. So I think we're going to conclude with one last question. Oh, Hannah, I think, I think we've covered pretty much. We have one last question from Tech Lee. Tech Lee is from Pavilion Capital. Hi, Prati. Any views on the feasibility of DeFi? Thank you for bringing this up. It's a very big topic.
DeFi is very, very interesting. It's a session itself. There's actually a different view within my own team on DeFi. For some of you who know Kevin and Anthony from my team, you should reach out to them. They have sort of different views. Mine is probably more on the conservative side. Much like the rest of what happens in the crypto space, it's still sort of staying within that crypto community and creating derivatives in the context of crypto assets. So it's only growing very fast. In fact, we are invested in a couple of funds now, and we talk to them regularly in the US, and they are terribly, terribly excited by what's happening there. The big problem statement I always throw back is, can we bring some of that into the real world asset space, right? And that's where I think there are different views on this. But frankly, DeFi is growing. You're also in a low rate environment, likely to stay that way for longer, which gives all the more impetus, for some of these efforts. But I'm not the deep expert on DeFi, so I'm not going to sit here and purport to be that. You should touch base with Anthony in particular, and then maybe even with Kevin on our team if you know them. They will give you a deep rundown and maybe even do long virtual drinks with you and debate on this for hours.
Great. We should have Kevin and also Anthony to be on our DeFi panel, because we do have a DeFi panel coming up. So we're going to have some of the MakerDAO, synthetics, in some of the leading DeFi projects to come and talk about what excites them and what are the limitations or challenges they're facing. We have Ivan Liu from Huobi. So question. I actually don't quite understand the question. If I want to transfer from them. Yeah, this question I'm not quite sure. What do I need to prepare if I want to transfer from crypto trading business to blockchain investment? I think it sounds like a personal career advice.
Yeah,
up to you if you want to take this question.
I wouldn't know how to answer that. I mean, I would not be driven by a passion. Go find, if you really think you want to do blockchain investments, please don't go with the flavor of the month, right? Would really recommend doing deep research on the areas that are breaking through, and then making potentially even concentrated bets in those areas, because right now the space is just so many ideas, so many new platforms coming up that, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, sometimes you just get lucky when you make money.
Thank you, Prati. I think, can I ask one last question? Then we'll conclude this. And we've been greeting you for a good hour and a half, close to that. So thank you so much for sparing the time, sharing your thoughts, given you're really in the forefront of pushing boundaries and this. And it's really a good sign that we're seeing some of the governments, entities, and more influential traditional investors are coming to this space. My question is, how do you get, this is actually one of the questions that was raised during our previous panel, which we had a bunch of blockchain native investors, right? And one of the questions is, how do we get traditional institutional investors over the line to start really taking this space more seriously? I think your background, you used to do a lot of investing in this space. So what do you think, what are the things you're seeing in this area, and how far are we from seeing traditional investors being super active in this space?
Yeah, so I think there is, we have seen a spate. I mean, I think there's two levels, right? There's always the asset holders, presumably where the question directly comes from, and then there's the equity layer. What I would say is that if I look at the activity we're seeing at the infrastructure layer, Emma, and it's not just the number of players coming up, but the sophistication of the offerings and actually the volumes that we're beginning to see. We've actually started seeing early signs of institutional investors beginning to make small allocations into the space. And it's probably coming more out of the US and Europe. Generally, what I would say is that the heady days of getting like 1000x returns is kind of, I would say, arguably gone. So we do need to see more stability. And now you can see outsized return in consumer to the risk, but we definitely need to start seeing more stability in some of these underlying tokens and assets for institutions to be coming in a meaningful way. Also, actually, ironically, the maturing of certain ecosystems is actually quite important. So if you take, you have Bitcoin obviously, but then you've got specific token, and there are very specific cryptos where applications are being built, and therefore the cryptos now actually playing a much broader role, and it's maturing, right? And I won't call out on this discussion today, but there are one or two where I would almost argue that they're here to stay, and unlike Bitcoin, actually have applications being built on top. That's where I think institutions would start getting a lot more comfort and would start coming in, because the infrastructure, etc., has been enabled. Wallets, communication protocols, etc., are all sort of fairly mature. So I think they would pass the enterprise grade test that would normally need to apply. So I would say a little bit more stability, a little bit more application building around specific ecosystems, and then you should start seeing institutions come in. On the equity side, there is a lot of fundraising happening globally, and which actually then provides the ability to support a bunch of applications. And we're seeing institutions make allocations to these funds. So I think if these cohort of funds, which came, say, a year or 2 years back, or coming now and next year, start generating good returns, that I think will give confidence to institutions to start co-investing into some of these platforms, and then eventually start doing direct investing into the platforms from an equity lens, right? So it's early days. I think a lot will depend on the next few years. Go back to the question of 2 years, 5 years. We just need somebody to make real money on some of these platforms, and then that will set the precedent for people to go ahead on the institutional
from equity perspective.
Or even the underlying tokens, like one of the funds we are invested in, we consciously gave it the mandate to do equity plus tokens. It doesn't have to be equity, right? I mean, equity.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Prati. Really appreciate you spending the time. Hopefully we can have you back really soon. And I think to the audiences there, thank you for sparing an hour and a half listening to Prati's insights. And we're really honored to have you here. So just a couple of things. We are right now recruiting for our upcoming batch, which is in partnership with Algorand. So for those of you who are not familiar with Algorand, it's funded by MIT professor Silvio Micali, and he's also a recipient of Turing Awards. So we're very excited about this partnership. They want to attract many exciting projects to build on their ecosystem. So the application is open. And also we have a series of other fireside chats. Like I mentioned, we will have a DeFi panel coming up, covering some of the being able to dive deeper into DeFi related topics. We also have a how to scale blockchain company conversation with Jing Chao from Binance and a couple of other ones. So please stay tuned. And thank you again, Pradi. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you everyone for the questions. Thank you.
Bye-bye.